It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have another hodgepodge episode, but we're just going to split it into two topics. We've got a UFC section and we've got a boxing section. But first thing I want to do is remind everyone to please subscribe. We could all use your help right now. Everybody in the space is struggling, us most of all, though. So if you could find it in your heart to help us out, that would be so ideal. Thank you. Now, John, how the heck are you?
Good. I'm just here with the cat is in the room, harassing me already. But other than that, I got my herbal tea that Hannah made for me. So hopefully I don't cough as bad today. So if I do, I will be muting. So if I don't answer, that's me hacking up a lung.
Okay. Well, I guess we should go ahead and kick it off. And we are going to start with the UFC section first. Now, this is going to be odd, but Tom Green recently went on Theo Von's show, and the conversation about an hour in turned towards how Theo got involved with the MAGA crowd. And he replied that it was because he'd met Trump at UFC events, and then he claimed that Trump won because of all the help that the UFC gave him. And he also noted that Dana White was, and I quote, such a great facilitator. He also noted that Kamala Harris turned him down flat while Trump was, all too eager to come onto his show. So what do you make of that conversation?
Well, the first one I'm going to note on is the Kamala Harris. He said they asked Kamala Harris and Waltz, but he wasn't clear like what kind of offer was made before the election, because he said they wouldn't show up even after the election. And I was thinking like, well, if you weren't very flexible before the election, obviously they're not going to show up after the election. They lost. There's no point in doing the show anymore. So I do have a question of, it could have been that they were turned down flat and Kamala just had no interest, but it also could have been that the opening they had for him wasn't as good as possible for Harris, and that they made another offer after the election, which again would be pointless, but we don't know. So that was a little up in the air about what happened with the Harris side. Although, to be fair, Harris's team did seem to want to stay away from those type of podcasts. So, which I do think he's right. That was a mistake on their part if she did flat out turn it down. Now, on the other portion, I found this interview very interesting, these comments by him. One, it's not the smoking gun that Dana White's like the secret guy behind everything and he put together all the podcasters, because, being a facilitator is a little different than being the guy that actually like intentionally goes out, contacts Vaughn and say, we want you to have Trump on the show. Instead, Vaughn asked, talked to Dana White and said he'd like to get Trump, and Dana said, we'll make it happen. But it does show the connections and kind of power. And he made a comment that he thought the UFC won it. Dana White and the UFC won it for Trump. That might be giving him a little too much credit, but they obviously played a part. But it shows the power that Dana White has with this connection of podcasters. Many of them who work for Endeavor, they have a podcasting arm, that they went out of their way to garner support for their fan base, which is not to be mean, a low information fan base voting. They're not regular voters. They're people that don't follow politics that much, but they got them to support Trump, and then they got him connected more so than his son Barron, who they credited. It seems more so that Dana White's responsible. They got him connected to these podcasters to get his reach out to these non-typical voters. So I thought it was interesting because, we talk about Dana being a power broker, and it seems kind of absurd, but at the same time, it is kind of true. The power that the UFC brand has made a fan base, they've made him the central figure of the brand, giving him more authority, more renown, and he's leveraged that now into helping, not leverage it into getting a part on Meta, but also leveraging it into politics. So he's a big player, which is shocking when you think about where he was 10, 15 years ago.
Indeed. Now, I want to give credit to Henderson on Blue Sky. He goes by @HendoSlice on Blue Sky. He is the one that reached out to us and let us know to check out this interview. So shout out to that man for his excellent submission. Now, my next question, sort of along the same vein, I saw a report that Joe Rogan lost 32% of his audience from last month to this one. And an article in Politico says that his obsession with Elon Musk could be the culprit behind it, citing that fans are becoming increasingly tired with his over-politicized format lately. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's very plausible. One is I know that what the Midas Touch became the #1 podcast, which I tried to. Man, I couldn't listen to that.
Me neither.
It's a terrible. I mean, it's not. They're the guys on it, I'm sure, have charisma and they have a fan base and everything, but it's like a cope podcast. It's one that just feeds people exactly what they want to hear, and I couldn't take that. But it shows. I do think there's something to it because, as we mentioned before, that Dana White helped Trump reach out to these kind of non-political, non-typical voters. That's Joe Rogan's fan base. They're people not super interested in politics generally. And now that he's kind of cramming politics on them, talking about, being a massive fan of Elon Musk, apparently makes comment that someone had tracked several of the last few shows. He's made positive comments and discussions about Elon Musk and everyone. And we saw the video clips of him talking about how Elon Musk doesn't need the money because he's rich, so you can trust him. Oh, to be so naive. That Elon Musk is, they pissed him off. He's now out to get him. That, just yet these often on the show, he'll have these comments about Elon Musk, and Elon Musk is approval ratings in the gutter. So you put that together, and it's not surprising that some of the fans, especially those that either do not want to hear politics or have different politics and do not want to hear those politics specifically, have kind of tuned out of the show. That's not surprising. And I think it's a warning sign, too, because this is something the UFC has to be concerned about. I think that's why Dana White instantly after the election said, we don't get involved in politics. Even though, as we've seen from Theo Von and what happened in the election, they were very involved in politics. You can see why the UFC is now trying to pivot back, because they do not want to turn off a fan base kind of like Joe Rogan has right now by being too political. So you might keep a large portion of your fans, but you got to remember the country's basically split 50-50. I think it's truthfully split more like 1/3 on the left, 1/3 on the right, 1/3, I should say, Democrats, 1/3 Republicans, and another third that don't really care if, flop in the wind. But you don't want to piss off a third for sure, because that's a third of the audience, and potentially 2/3 if it goes badly. So I think that's what the UFC has made made that obvious pivot back to not being into politics, even though it's obvious they are definitely knee deep, waist deep, chest deep into politics.
Do you think that with, everything that's going on with this administration and basically getting ready to put us in the poorhouse, that UFC might actually reverse a little bit?
Unless I could see him reversing somewhat not against Trump, but against Musk. If Musk approval rating continues to slide, if people's opinion of Doge slides, and if we run into problems because of what Doge's actions, a lot of people are excited right now because they're laying off the federal workforce, thinking like, oh, that's going to save us money. But you got to remember, the federal workforce is only 4% of the budget. You could lay off half the federal workforce, right? And you're only saving 2% of the budget, right? So you're not saving a ton of money laying off the federal workforce. On top of that, 1/3 of the federal workforce are veterans. So you have the bad PR of a lot of veterans without jobs. And on top of it, sometimes getting rid of a workforce doesn't make things more efficient. Imagine if you laid off half the people at the DMV. We saved money. There's half the people working at the DMV, but that already took a long time before. Now it takes twice as long, 3-4 times as long. So there's a chance that things get bad in that regard. And then there's also the third rail of Medicare and Social Security that where the real savings potentially would have to be found if you're trying to cut the federal budget. So there's a chance that there'll be blowback against Musk. I could see the UFC, pivoting against Doge and Musk, taking to go with the wins and that, but they are tied with Trump so much. It would seem hypocritical for them to abandon him, considering how much effort they put into getting him elected.
I saw that Ari Emanuel is also a huge fan of Elon Musk, though.
He's OpenAI, trying to acquire OpenAI with him.
Ugh, wow. Okay, so let's talk about UFC London for a moment, because tickets are ridiculous, like crazy expensive. And there was a comparison that came out today that showed that you could see Taylor Swift cheaper. You could get a Man City season ticket. There was like this whole slate of items that you could do and do a lot cheaper than getting one ticket to UFC London. What the heck is going on with UFC ticket sales?
Well, first of all, what arena is the UFC London card going to be at? It's at the O2, right?
I believe so.
Which has like what, a 20,000, 15,000 capacity?
Mm-hmm.
And the other ones are at, in football, soccer stadiums, as we hear the Yanks call it. They're at larger arenas. So there's more tickets available. That's one. Two is the UFC does fewer events in London. They're only there like once or twice a year, where, Man City and even Taylor Swift, there are going to be multiple shows across. They might not be, I don't know how many shows she's doing in London, but she's probably not a show that's not too far away, that's within driving distance if you had to get a ticket. So there is some, the comparison is not quite apt. That said, the UFC has mastered the art of pushing up ticket prices as high as possible. And I got to give hats off to them on whoever's was in charge of this, because they've done a great job. And forget the London card, which actually has some decent name fighters on it. The Seattle card, was kind of on name value, was not that magnificent a card, right? And yet it did 3.8 million. 3.8 million. That blows. I mean, a few years ago, that would have been a pay-per-view cards gate. Just huge numbers for live attendance for a fight night that, was okay, but there's no fight on there that's worth 3.8 million. And so the UFC's done a great job of pushing up ticket prices. And it's not just that they're not just that they're manipulating ticket prices. And I use manipulate loosely here. What they're really doing is putting out a few tickets at a time. We see this in boxing too. If you look at what boxing tickets they count, sales that they kind of go through this, that the small amount of tickets are issued so they can maximize the sales. UFC on pay-per-views also did a good job of linking it to celebrities and stuff. They're just and scarcity by keeping stuff at the apex, driving up prices. They've done that good, but there's something too. They develop a culture where people feel the need that they have to go to a UFC event, to the UFC event, not the specific fights, which is surprising. I mean, it's, we see big fighters, big names sell more tickets. Obviously, McGregor was on the cusp of selling a 30 million plus gate. Same with the original Stipe versus Jones. Certain fights generate huge gates, but now they can generate huge gates just on the UFC brand. And just because they built a fan base that you have to make a pilgrimage or something to go to a UFC event. So I think that's what those two things together, that they're really good at maximizing and monetizing the ticket price to maximize the amount of value they can sell ticket for, to keep the prices as high as possible through various means. And then on top of it, the fan base feels the need, at least some of the fan base. The people I talk to, none of them really feel they have to go to a UFC event, but the guys that are on camera freaking out, doing air pump with their fists, doing air punching, shadow boxing, when they put the camera on them, those yahoos, they have to pay a lot of money. They have to go to a UFC event. And so that's what they can collect money.
Ilia Topuria, let's talk about him for a moment, because he vacated his featherweight title last week so that he could move up to lightweight. But he just refused to fight Arman Tsarukyan, who was offered up to him, saying that it's a title fight with Makhachev or it's nothing. Is he in a position to make those demands?
I mean, no fighter is really in a position to make demands to the UFC. The UFC can wait any fighter out. They're a repeat player, so he can, if they wanted to, they can make him sit. They have guaranteed contractual revenues. So they're going to make their money no matter what, and just make him sit and use all the other fighters they have in their toolkit to make their money now, and eventually he'll come around. But they also might want to play a little ball with him because he is a big star, and they can take advantage of him now. I'm not sure. Reading between the lines with Dana White, like saying that fight is not guaranteed to happen because there's other stuff going on. I do think there's a possibility that maybe Makhachev is going to move up to welterweight, and that's what he's kind of hinting at, that he has to set Topuria up for a fight to maybe to take not the interim title, but if he leaves the belt behind, to actually be crowned the new lightweight champion, to fight for that. I'm kind of reading between the lines, but that's what it sounds like. But is Topuria a big star, Topuria, and can he make some demands? Yes. Can he compel the UFC to do stuff they don't want to? He's not Canelo Alvarez. He's not. I mean, in boxing you can do that because promoters are dependent on the boxers for the revenue. UFC does, if they want to, they can wait them out.
Poatan. We got to talk about Alex Pereira for a second, because I asked you this last night and decided to wait until today to get your answer. So I'm going to be, along with everybody else, getting the answer firsthand right now. So I noticed that his Chama slogan is getting a ton of mileage, like everywhere. Is there a way that the UFC could capitalize on that without him?
Well, I mean, UFC could just use it. They could use Chama as some sort of label or whatever. I think you might be referring to the contractual provision we talked about a while ago that says, whatever intellectual property a fighter comes up with as a fighter, the UFC owns it. And to be clear, it doesn't mean like if you're just walking down the street and you have an idea and then you write it up, the UFC conveys ownership. It's basically much more like the idea of a good example under that contractual provision would be Nate Diaz saying in the ring, "I'm not surprised, motherfuckers," right? And then if he went out and copyrighted, just like Ronda Rousey did with God, I can't remember what her one was.
Do nothing, bitches.
Do nothing, bitches. Yeah, that she made a whole thing, T-shirts and stuff. The UFC could conceivably, based on that where that contractual provision is, step and said, "No, that you came up with that on our platform, and so we own that, or at least we'll negotiate a stake with you." But in this case, Chama is like a very common Portuguese or Brazilian slang in certain parts of Brazil, right?
Right.
And so you can't really copyright common terminology, and on top of that, it's something that's known outside the UFC. So there's no way this was not something he sprung up and invented for the first time on the UFC stage. It's a common slang in Brazil, and he was using it before, saying it and stuff. So there's no way the UFC could make claim to that.
What I was thinking more along the lines of is they could release like a line and have Chama on it and just like not do anything.
I think they easily could, because again, it's a common slang term in Brazil. Anybody could basically come up, I think, could do that, and just not have, as long as you don't have an image or something that's connecting that links it directly to Poatan. But the UFC could very well have a UFC, Chama T-shirt or something like that. I think they very well could do that and not have to cut him in at all, because it's.
Would they use his image? Because they're sort of intertwined as far as UFC goes.
Well, if they use his image, because of the merchandise licensing agreement, they would have to pay him.
Okay.
But they would have to pay him according to the merchandise licensing agreement, which is either 15 or 30%, 30% of the net or 15% of the gross. So, he would not get a bigger cut just because he came up with that. Okay. So
that was where I was going with that. Is it?
But the other thing interesting, if they sell that merch, they did do that at an arena, and they sold the material at the arena, or
nothing for him, right?
The event revenue, event merch sales, the fighters don't get a cut of that.
Also, it's so popular, they could put it on a shirt, put it on a whole line, and never put his image, and then they don't have to cut him in on anything, right?
They could, but other T-shirt makers could do that too. Just come with a Shama T-shirt. But the UFC, I mean, having it in the arena where people might buy it, just don't put his image on it. Well, again, even if you have his image, it's event merchandise. You could make a lot of money.
Okay. Now let's switch gears here. Let's talk about boxing. And, gentle reminder, folks, subscribe. All right. So we talked about UFC ticket sales. Let's talk about boxing's ticket sales. How are they doing?
Well, I think typical boxing events they're doing right now is that they have a much bigger fluctuation than the UFC. You see some events do 1.5 million, some do more. What we haven't seen in the United States, we haven't seen the big 20+ mil gates. That's kind of like our current level of like super fight. We saw that level with in 2023 with Canelo and Charlo and Tank versus Ryan Garcia and Spence versus Crawford. 3 fights that you're just gangbusters, and we've got nothing similar this year happening so far. So ticket sales. If you look at the event by event, they do look like they're doing kind of like typical boxing event sales, some high, some lower. It fluctuates wildly, but we're not seeing big ticket sales. At least I'm not seeing in the United States this year or I should say not just this year, the last 12 months, because last year even, because we just do not have those type of events being staged in the United States right now.
Okay. Why was the Bivol-Beterbiev fight moved to a smaller venue?
Well, I heard that it was because ticket sales were weak. They didn't want a half empty arena, so they moved it, or maybe more than half empty. And I think just shows one thing is that the Saudis are paying a big site fee, and I guess technically it's not. I think some of them, if you look at like Anthony Joshua and some other finances of how the paid, it looks like it might be they do it as a sponsorship than a site fee, but I'm not sure how they exactly do it, but let's call it a site fee. They pay big site fees, but the tickets are cheap there. They're cheap and there's no demand. And so that's kind of sad. I want to say this event that we had yesterday, it was fun to watch, although boxing, if you're going to do a super card, I think, first I prefer 3 to 4 fight cards for boxing. That's kind of like the perfect number. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to do a super fight card, 5, I think would be the max, because a lot of them go to decision. They're longer fights, just drags out too long. 7 is just too much. 5 would have been better, but they had this. I thought a lot of the production in the arena was great. I thought they did a better job of, after all, turning the fights over. The broadcast team, I'm still not sold on. But it was a better production. So I give them a lot of credit on the production, and the fights were
pretty goddamn good.
Very enjoyable. I mean, the Jacob Parker's win was unnecessary. It was comical. I'll give that. Mm-hmm. Over cool, but not. We could have probably lost that fight and had a better card overall. But overall, it was a entertaining card. But there's not a demand there. And there's a demand. I don't know if that fight card would have sold gangbusters, because again, you don't have the right superstars put together. You need the right package to sell gangbusters in America.
Can I ask you something really quick?
Yeah.
You said we don't have the right superstars. Do you think they're doing a good job promoting the big talent? Because there's no question about the talent level of Bivol and Beterbiev, but there is a question about the drawing power. So do you think they're doing a good job in that department? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!